2 million years ago, long before our own species appeared, the heart of Africa was a restless world of cracked earth, wandering herds, and skies streaked with dust. In this harsh environment, a new kind of hominin began to rise, Homo erectus. They did not know they were special. They had no words for themselves, no maps, no stories of destiny. Yet everything about their bodies and behavior quietly prepared them for a journey that would one day carry their descendants far beyond the African horizon. They stood taller than earlier hominins, with long legs, narrow hips, and a spine balanced for distance walking. Their feet acted like spring-loaded levers, each step storing and releasing energy. Their rib cage and pelvis were shaped to hold powerful muscles for breathing, letting them walk and jog for hours under the burning sun without collapsing from heat. While other animals panted in the shade, Homo erectus could keep moving, following herds, shadowing predators, and reaching waterholes that lay days away. Around them, the landscape was changing in ways that demanded adaptation. Climatic shifts turned once stable forests into unstable mosaics of woodland, scrub, and open grassland. Lakes swelled during wet periods, then shrank back to muddy basins during long droughts, leaving behind isolated pockets of life. Herds of antelope, wild cattle, and elephants no longer stayed in one place. They drifted along ancient corridors in search of grazing and water, and the predators followed. To survive, Homo erectus had to follow as well. Movement was no longer optional. It was the core of their existence. In small bands, they began to stretch their home ranges, tracking the seasonal pulse of the land. A dried-up stream might push them to crest a ridge they had never crossed before. A distant storm might draw them toward the faint promise of new water. Each decision seemed small and practical. Go where food is. Stay near water. Avoid the dens of great cats and packs of hyenas. But in the slow arithmetic of evolution, these small choices added up to something immense. Their stone tools became silent partners in this wandering life. With carefully knapped flakes and heavy hand axes, they could strip meat from scavenged carcasses faster than vultures, crack thick bones to reach the rich marrow inside, and slice tough hides into usable strips. Every successful cut meant more calories, more strength, more time to explore instead of simply endure. Knowledge spread not through spoken language as we know it, but through imitation, habit, and patient observation. Children watched elders shape stone, watched them choose where to camp and where not to, when to approach water and when to hang back and listen. The landscape slowly turned into a memory map etched into their minds. This valley for the dry season, that rocky shelf for night shelters, that distant line of hills for times of terrible drought. Over thousands of generations, groups of Homo erectus ranged farther and farther from the places where their ancestors first stood upright. No single band announced a grand departure from Africa. There was no moment when one individual pointed north and declared a mission. Instead, the migration was a slow, breathing wave made of families, hunger, courage, and accident. Some groups pushed into cooler highlands, others traced the fingers of rivers winding toward the edges of the continent. From their point of view, they were simply doing what had always worked, following trails of survival. Yet with every step into unfamiliar land, the world of Homo erectus grew larger, and the invisible path out of Africa began to take shape. They were not explorers in a heroic tale, but animals responding to shifting pressures. Still, within their simple decisions lived the seeds of everything that would come later. Each time a cautious group decided to stay one more season near a new lake, they anchored a fresh point on the expanding map of human presence. Each time a band skirted the edge of an unknown forest, marking safe paths in their memory, they made it slightly easier for the next generation to go farther. Little by little, the line between home and away blurred. Home was no longer a single valley or hillside. Home became movement itself, the familiar rhythm of footsteps in dust, the sound of stone striking stone, the smell of distant rain carried on the wind. Long before Homo erectus ever walked out of Africa, Africa had already taught them how to live on the move. As generations passed, the wandering bands of Homo erectus slowly transformed Africa into a continent of pathways. They learned the patterns of rivers that rose during the rains and shrank into muddy channels during droughts. They learned which valleys held edible roots after wildfires and which cliffs sheltered them from prowling lions at night. With every migration season, the knowledge of the land deepened, and the confidence to push into new regions grew. But the most powerful force shaping their movement came not from the predators or the herds, but from the shifting climate that ruled Africa like an unpredictable sovereign. Periods of cooling brought stretches of open grasslands, while warming phases invited forests to return. Rain belts drifted north and south, carving famine into some regions and abundance into others. These cycles stretched across thousands of years, but to Homo erectus, each shift brought immediate consequences. A lake that had sustained a band for generations might suddenly retreat, leaving behind cracked earth and stranded fish that died under the sun. Groups that remained risked starvation. Those who moved, even hesitantly, discovered new pockets of life, wetlands fed by underground springs, river deltas rich with sedges and mollusks, and highland slopes where afternoon storms delivered precious moisture. Little by little, movement became not only a survival strategy, but a cultural expectation. Young individuals grew up knowing that change was constant, that nothing stayed still, that safety depended on watching the land and trusting the subtle signals that their elders recognized. They noticed the angle of shadow inside dry ravines, the scent of wet soil carried by wind, the flight patterns of vultures that hinted at distant carcasses. They became readers of an unwritten world. At night, when fires flickered low, the older members of a group kept watch over sleeping children, listening to hyenas calling across the plains. Fire itself was a powerful ally, though still unpredictable. They likely did not create it at will yet, but learned to maintain embers from natural blazes. A burning branch was both a weapon and a symbol of safety, keeping predators at bay and giving warmth during cold nights. Over time, this fragile mastery of fire allowed them to occupy new environments previously dominated by fear: caves, rocky overhangs, and open plains where night temperatures dropped sharply. These places became temporary homes, marked by discarded bones, clusters of stone flakes, and soot-stained walls. Season by season, these temporary homes shifted, forming a trail of occupation sites across East Africa that archaeologists would uncover 2 million years later. While their migrations were slow, they were not aimless. The land shaped their decisions, but Homo erectus shaped the land in return. Each time they napped a stone, they altered the possibilities of their next journey. Each time they discovered a new corridor between valleys, they created a biological and cultural bridge for future generations. Bands that had once been isolated began encountering others, exchanging mates, genes, and tool-making techniques. This mixing strengthened their populations and spread innovations across vast distances. The world of Homo erectus was not empty. It teemed with giant predators, saber-toothed cats lurking in tall grass, massive hyenas capable of crushing bones, and packs of wild dogs pursuing prey with relentless endurance. Homo erectus had to exist among these threats, neither dominating nor being dominated. Their survival depended on a delicate balance of caution and boldness. Occasionally, groups stumbled upon unfamiliar territories where predators behaved differently, or where the vegetation hid dangers they had never seen. Yet each challenge taught them something, and each lesson became part of the collective memory carried silently in their movements. Over tens of thousands of years, their path extended toward the northern edges of Africa. There was no boundary, no sign marking the limit of their ancestral land. To them, the world simply continued. Valleys gave way to plateaus, rivers branched into deltas, and distant mountains rose like invitations to explore. Step by step, Homo erectus followed these natural guides, unaware that their slow, persistent journey would eventually lead them out of Africa entirely. What began as scattered movements driven by necessity was becoming something much larger. The first expansion of humans into a world far beyond the one their ancestors had known. And though they had no words for it, the quiet momentum of their migrations was beginning to reshape the future of the human story. As Homo erectus continued their gradual expansion across the African continent, the northern frontier of their world slowly came into view. It was not a single place or a dramatic landmark marking the edge of an ancient homeland. Instead, it was a vast network of river valleys, rocky plateaus, and shifting grasslands that bridged the heart of Africa with the lands beyond. No generation understood they were approaching a boundary. They simply moved the way their ancestors had always moved, following food, chasing water, and adjusting to the seasons. But with every cycle of drought and recovery, the push northward became more pronounced. Each generation traveled slightly farther than the one before. With time, the familiar rhythms of East Africa faded behind them, replaced by new patterns of rainfall, new scents carried on northern winds, and new animals whose behaviors had to be learned from scratch. Herds of aurochs, wild horses, and fallow deer appeared in regions where earlier generations had known only antelope and zebra. Predators shifted as well. The saber-toothed cats grew rarer, replaced by powerful northern lions and packs of wolves hunting in dense formations. These changes required adaptation of both body and mind. Yet Homo erectus thrived in this environmental complexity. Their endurance-based mobility allowed them to track new kinds of prey over long distances. Their stone tools became more standardized as they encountered harder rocks in the northern highlands. Flint, basalt, and chert cracked differently under skilled hands, producing sharper and more durable cutting edges. Groups that mastered these materials gained an advantage, pushing deeper into unfamiliar lands with confidence. As they followed river systems branching like ancient tree roots across the landscape, they discovered pockets of richness, oases where underground springs fed clusters of vegetation, and valleys where seasonal floods left behind nutrient-rich sediment. Some bands lingered in these places for years, raising children who would grow up knowing a northern world their ancestors had never seen. These children carried a different mental map of the land. To them, the northern horizon was not a frontier. It was home. Meanwhile, further south, other groups continued to roam older territories, ensuring that the movement of Homo erectus remained a diffuse wave rather than a single migration. This diversity of experiences strengthened the species as a whole. Knowledge flowed not as formal teaching, but as instinctive practices: when to travel, where to camp, how to recognize safe waterholes, and how to interpret the tracks of predators that looked similar yet behaved differently from those in East Africa. Fire, once a fragile companion, became more firmly integrated into their survival. Though they still could not create flames on command, they grew increasingly adept at preserving embers, carrying smoldering material wrapped in bark or coated in damp clay. Extend the lifespan of fire between camps. This control allowed them to inhabit colder highlands and survive nights that would have been fatal to earlier hominins. It also enabled them to cook more frequently, softening tough meats and roots that otherwise required long chewing. Every advantage accumulated quietly, strengthening their resilience. As they advanced farther north, the terrain changed dramatically. Open plains gave way to rugged cliffs and narrow passes carved over millennia by ancient rivers. In some areas, deserts expanded, forcing groups to choose between crossing harsh environments or retreating to more fertile valleys. Some bands pushed forward, timing their journeys with rare seasonal rains, while others remained behind, settling in the margins of safer lands. These different decisions created branching paths in the great migration of Homo erectus. Some routes led to dead ends where water vanished and game disappeared. Other routes served as natural corridors, guiding them toward the Sinai, the Levant, and beyond. At first, these paths were narrow threads of possibility, but with each successful crossing, they widened into established trails, reinforced by the footsteps of countless generations. By the time Homo erectus reached the northern edge of Africa, their identity as a species had fully fused with the concept of movement. They had become walkers of continents, pioneers by necessity, and architects of the first human expansion beyond the birthplace of their lineage. Without knowing it, they were approaching a threshold that would reshape not only their own destiny, but the entire future of humanity. Ahead lay landscapes no African ancestor had ever seen, climates harsher and colder, predators unfamiliar, but also opportunities that would challenge and transform the species forever. The first humans were about to leave Africa. The gradual push toward the northern edge of Africa did not unfold as a single dramatic journey, but as a slow accumulation of thousands of small decisions made over countless generations. Each band of Homo erectus reacted to the land immediately around them, unaware that their movements formed part of a vast continental shift. Droughts tightened their grip on familiar valleys. Rivers that once flowed year-round became seasonal trickles. In some regions, volcanic activity reshaped the terrain, creating barriers where open plains once stretched. Yet every new challenge carried opportunities, and every opportunity demanded adaptation. The groups that ventured farther north began to encounter climates unlike those of their ancestral homelands. Summers remained hot, but winters grew colder. Night temperatures dropped sharply, and sudden storms swept across the plateaus. These new conditions tested the limits of Homo erectus physiology. Their long limbs and efficient sweat-based cooling worked brilliantly under heat, but cold posed new risks. Fire became not just a tool for safety, but a requirement for survival. Maintaining embers through long nights grew into a crucial skill. They learned which types of wood smoldered longest, which barks insulated heat, and where lightning-scarred trees offered dry fuel even after heavy rains. Bands that mastered flame retention gained access to environments that others avoided. As they pressed into these northern territories, encounters with unfamiliar animals became regular events. The herds moved differently here. Horses darted in unpredictable bursts, requiring new tracking strategies. Larger bovids defended themselves with coordinated group behavior rather than panic-driven scattering. Even the predators forced changes in behavior. Wolves hunted with endurance rather than explosive strength, and early northern lions displayed patterns that differed from their African counterparts. Observing these animals became part of survival, shaping a more flexible understanding of the world. The endless movement also reshaped the social fabric of Homo erectus groups. Families that settled near seasonal watering holes often remained long enough to raise multiple children before moving again, while other groups drifted in and out of the area, creating moments of overlap. During these overlaps, exchanges quietly took place. Tools traded, gestures learned, mates introduced into bands, strengthening genetic diversity. Such interactions prevented isolation and allowed innovations to spread quickly across vast distances without requiring direct communication or complex language. Their stone tools evolved as well. Northern stone sources offered materials that fractured differently, producing longer, sharper flakes. Acheulean hand axes became more symmetrical and durable. With each improvement, Homo erectus gained more control over their environment. They could butcher large animals faster, defend themselves more effectively, and make efficient use of carcasses that predators abandoned. This increased efficiency meant more calories, more energy, and more time. Time to move farther, time to explore, time to survive harsh climate shifts that extinguished less adaptable species. Over thousands of years, a web of migratory routes formed across northern Africa. Some led toward the Sinai Peninsula, others toward the Mediterranean coast, and still others curved westward into what would one day become the Atlas foothills. Bands followed these paths seasonally, sometimes retreating south when winters grew brutal, sometimes pushing north during periods of warmth. Their presence expanded and contracted like a living tide. Eventually, some groups reached landscapes fundamentally different from anything their ancestors had known. Narrow land bridges exposed during periods of low sea levels, coastlines rich with shellfish, and river valleys that stretched into the Levant. These corridors were not always open. Climate could close them for centuries before reopening them again. But the persistence of Homo erectus meant that whenever conditions aligned, they were ready. When herds moved through these corridors, humans followed. When water flowed in temporary channels, humans approached. When forests thinned and grasslands expanded across the Sinai and Levant, humans stepped forward. The crossing out of Africa was not a single event. It was the culmination of 1 million quiet footsteps, each one driven by hunger, curiosity, and the unspoken instinct to move toward whatever offered a better chance at life. As Homo erectus entered the Levant for the first time, they became the first humans to stand on soil outside Africa. They did not know they had crossed a threshold, but from that moment onward, humanity would never again be confined to a single continent. The journey had truly begun. Crossing into the Levant did not happen as a single heroic moment, but as a slow merging of African wanderers with new landscapes that stretched endlessly to the north. When Homo erectus first stepped into the Levantine corridor, they found a world both familiar and entirely foreign. The sun still burned hot across open plains, but the vegetation shifted into a patchwork of grasses, shrubs, and woodlands, unlike the savannas of Africa. The air carried new scents, pine resin from distant forests, the cool moisture of highland valleys, and the faint mineral smell of limestone cliffs shaped by ancient seas. To the bands moving through this region, the land must have felt vast, layered with possibilities and dangers they had no inherited memory for. Yet their instinctive adaptability, honed over hundreds of thousands of years in Africa, guided them step by cautious step. The animals they encountered revealed just how different this northern world was. Deer with branching antlers darted through wooded areas, requiring new forms of tracking and ambush. Herds of wild cattle grew larger and more aggressive, forcing Homo erectus to observe their behavior from a safe distance. Even the predators had changed. Wolves hunted in disciplined packs, communicating with eerie howls that echoed through the hills. Northern lions roamed the plains, larger and more muscular than many African counterparts. These encounters demanded new strategies for movement, shelter, and timing. The skills of Africa could not simply be repeated here, they had to be reshaped. Fortunately, Homo erectus possessed the mental flexibility to adapt without complex language or formal teaching. Learning came through imitation, trial and error, and shared experience. When a band discovered a valley rich in edible tubers, they stayed long enough for children to memorize the terrain. If another band passed through seasons later, the traces of abandoned tools or hearths offered silent clues about where food might still be found. In this way, knowledge diffused slowly but reliably across the region. Stone tool innovation accelerated as well. The Levant offered materials that fractured more cleanly than many African stones. Flint outcrops gleamed beneath eroded hillsides, and chert beds lined riverbanks. When struck with the right force, these stones produced long, razor-sharp flakes capable of cutting through hide and sinew with minimal effort. For Homo erectus, who depended heavily on scavenging large carcasses, this improvement was transformative. The faster they could remove meat or extract marrow, the less time they spent exposed to predators. Over time, the craftsmanship of their Acheulean hand axes became more refined, with edges shaped through careful alternation of flakes. These tools were not just functional objects, they were extensions of survival, carried across vast distances and passed down through generations. As they moved deeper into the Levant, the climate presented both gifts and challenges. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically between seasons, creating temporary rivers that carved through limestone and then vanished during dry periods. Some years brought mild winters and abundant plant growth. Other years froze the land under bitter winds that swept in from the northern mountains. Fire, though still difficult to create from scratch, became a lifeline. Embers preserved in bark bundles allowed families to survive cold nights and cook tough roots that otherwise offered little nutrition. Bands that lost their fire were forced to seek it from neighboring groups or track lightning-struck trees. The presence or absence of flame could determine whether a group stayed in the region or retreated back south. Shelters also evolved. Instead of simply occupying open plains or shallow caves, Homo erectus began using rock overhangs, cliff alcoves, and small caverns carved by ancient water flow. These places protected them from winter winds and allowed more consistent use of fire. The soot stains left behind became the first fingerprints of humanity in the Levant, marks that would be rediscovered nearly 2 million years later. Social interactions shifted as well. The Levantine corridor created natural funnels where groups occasionally encountered one another. These meetings, though likely tense at first, allowed the exchange of mates and ideas. A new style of hand axe in one group could quietly spread across entire regions over centuries. Such exchanges prevented genetic isolation and strengthened the population as a whole. Yet despite all these adaptations, movement remained the defining rhythm of their existence. The Levant was not a final destination, but another chapter in a journey that stretched far beyond imagination. As seasons shifted and generations passed, some bands continued northward into colder lands, while others remained, carving out a life in valleys that balanced forests and open grasslands. Homo erectus had taken humanity's first steps out of Africa, and they were still moving. As Homo erectus settled deeper into the Levant, their presence began to carve subtle but lasting impressions onto the landscape. Their campsites, though temporary, appeared repeatedly along the same seasonal corridors, near springs that never fully dried, under cliffs that shielded them from northern winds, beside river bends where herds frequently paused to drink. Each return reinforced these places as nodes in an expanding network of survival. Over time, the Levant became a living classroom, a place where early humans learned to navigate a world more varied than any they had known in Africa. They discovered that the land changed dramatically across short distances. A single day's walk might take them from open plains into dense woodlands, then into rocky foothills where streams cut deep channels through limestone. Such diversity demanded flexible strategies. The techniques that worked in the grasslands, persistence tracking, long-distance walking, ambushes near watering spots, needed modification when the terrain shifted into wooded valleys or steep ridges. Children born in this region adapted instinctively. Their earliest memories were shaped not only by wide horizons, but also by forest shadows, the echo of wolves calling in the night, and the alternating warmth and chill brought by seasonal winds. These children grew into adults who navigated the Levant with a fluency earlier generations could never have imagined. Stone tools remained their constant companions, yet the abundance of high-quality materials in the region transformed toolmaking into an art honed by necessity. Flint nodules cracked into thin, deadly slices with minimal effort. Bands often carried these sharp flakes for miles, preserving them carefully and replacing them only when absolutely necessary. The Acheulean hand axe, already a defining symbol of Homo erectus craftsmanship, became even more finely shaped. Its edges grew more symmetrical, its weight more balanced, making it a versatile tool for both scavenging and protection. These improvements were not sudden leaps, but gradual refinements passed silently from one generation to the next. Fire use deepened in importance as winters pressed harder against the region. In colder seasons, nights stretched longer, and bodies needed warmth to endure. Fires glowed along rock overhangs, casting flickering shadows on limestone walls. Families huddled close, preserving embers at dawn by burying them under ash or wrapping them in plant fibers. Every ember carried forward was a thread connecting one campsite to the next, binding the movements of multiple generations into a continuous chain of survival. With fire came cooked food, animal marrow softened by heat, roots rendered digestible, and tough meat transformed into valuable calories. These changes supported the growth of more robust bodies and likely expanded the energy available to the developing brain. The Levant, with its alternating abundance and scarcity, created an environmental pressure that rewarded groups capable of innovation and endurance. Encounters with predators remained a constant threat. Wolves prowled the outskirts of camps, drawn by the smell of cooked meat. Lions, more cautious yet far stronger, stalked watering holes and ambushed prey near riverbanks. Homo erectus learned to read these dangers, often using firelight to deter approaching predators. Over time, they likely recognized patterns in animal behavior, how wolves circled before attacking, how lions preferred particular routes through brush, and how scavengers like hyenas converged on carcasses from downwind. These insights became woven into the collective intuition that guided their daily lives. Social interactions grew more complex as multiple bands crossed paths, especially during seasons when resources concentrated in particular valleys. These meetings could produce tension. Territory, mates, and food were precious, but they also offered opportunities. The exchange of tools, partners, and knowledge allowed cultural traits to spread across groups separated by vast distances. Such interconnections strengthened the resilience of the species, allowing innovations to survive long after individual bands dispersed. As centuries accumulated, the Levant became not merely a transit route, but a region of stability for many groups. Some stayed for decades, developing a deep familiarity with local rhythms. Others continued moving, drawn by the promise of cooler lands to the north or by environmental pressures that pushed them onward. It was this continuous outward movement, often subtle and unplanned, that eventually guided Homo erectus toward regions no African-born ancestor had ever experienced. Beyond the Levant lay mountains, steppes, and distant river valleys stretching into Eurasia. To reach them, Homo erectus had to evolve once more, physically, mentally, and behaviorally. But they were already changing. Their bodies, their instincts, and their understanding of the world had expanded with every step beyond Africa. In the Levant, they had taken humanity's first steps into a truly global landscape. Now they stood at the edge of an even greater frontier, ready to follow the corridors of opportunity wherever they might lead. As Homo erectus pressed beyond the Levant, they entered a world unlike any they had encountered before. The familiar rhythm of African savannas and the mixed landscapes of the Levant began to give way to colder winds, thicker forests, and dramatic shifts in elevation. What lay ahead was the threshold of Eurasia, a vast, sprawling continent where temperatures swung violently between seasons and survival demanded new forms of ingenuity. For generations, the push northward had been slow and almost imperceptible. A drought one decade might drive a group farther along a river valley. A population boom in grazing animals could lure another band toward greener plains. Over centuries, those small nudges accumulated, drawing Homo erectus toward lands that their ancestors could never have imagined. The first major barrier they encountered was the rising highlands that framed the entrance into southwestern Asia. These foothills, shaped by tectonic collisions over millions of years, presented steep ridges and narrow passes carved by ancient rivers. For Homo erectus, whose bones and muscles were built for long-distance endurance rather than climbing, the mountains posed challenges that required patience and adaptation. Yet the advantages of these highlands were undeniable. They offered cooler climates during scorching summers, fresh water from snow-fed streams, and herds of game that grazed at higher elevations. At night, when winds swept through canyon floors, Homo erectus learned to seek shelter inside shallow caves or wedge themselves against rock walls where firelight could be preserved from gusts. These new shelters marked another shift in their behavior. In Africa and the Levant, they had relied heavily on open-air camps, relocating frequently to follow herds. But in the rugged frontiers of Eurasia, caves and rock chambers provided consistent refuge. The natural insulation of stone protected them from winter's bite and intensified their reliance on fire. Embers carried across long distances allowed entire bands to survive conditions that older generations might have fled from. Food sources changed as well. Instead of the predictable seasonal migrations of African ungulates, the Eurasian frontier offered megafauna with more complex behaviors. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the grasslands in small groups, their thick coats hinting at colder eras to come. Massive bovids grazed in herds, far stronger than anything Homo erectus faced in the Levant. Even the deer species of these regions behaved differently, moving in patterns shaped by harsh winters and short summers. To survive, Homo erectus had to learn these patterns through careful observation. Where animals sheltered during storms, which valleys offered fresh grazing after snowfall, and how to track prey in terrain where footprints faded quickly. Their stone tools adapted to meet the demands of this new environment. Flint remained valuable, but harder stones like basalt and quartzite became essential for tasks that required durability over sharpness. The Acheulean hand axe evolved further, its edges thicker and more resistant to shattering, its form more symmetrical for swinging and cutting against tough hide and frozen meat. These tools were not simply shaped, they were engineered by experience. For the first time, tool-making required attention to seasonal needs. A community preparing for winter might produce heavier axes, while summer travel encouraged lighter, sharper implements. These subtle shifts reflected a growing flexibility in the minds of Homo erectus, an early form of planning, rooted in instinct but shaped by collective memory. The social structure of these groups also began to shift. Life in harsher climates increased the importance of cooperation. A single mistake during cold months, losing fire, misjudging a storm, failing to find shelter, could threaten the entire band. Slowly, survival became more communal. Older individuals, experienced in reading weather patterns, became vital sources of knowledge. Children learned not only how the land worked, but how quickly it could turn against them. Their understanding of the world grew into something deeper than simple reaction. They became anticipators, creatures shaped by the need to think ahead, to remember past hardships, and to adjust their behavior before danger arrived. As generations marched onward through the rugged frontiers, Homo erectus began leaving traces across Eurasia. Stone flakes scattered in caves, butchered bones in river valleys, and faint soot lines where ancient fires once burned. Each mark was a footprint of humanity's expanding reach. They were no longer creatures of a single continent. They were pioneers of a new world, crossing boundaries shaped not by intention, but by persistence. And ahead of them stretched an even greater expanse, endless forests, frozen plains, and the towering shadow of the Eurasian heartland that would test the limits of their endurance unlike anything before. As Homo erectus advanced deeper into the Eurasian frontier, the world around them became increasingly unpredictable. Seasons grew sharper in contrast, summers brief and hot, winters long and merciless. The African-born physiology that once thrived under equatorial heat now had to contend with frost, icy winds, and fleeting daylight. Yet it was precisely these challenges that forged a new resilience within them. Their survival depended not on strength alone, but on an expanding repertoire of behaviors shaped by memory, observation, and an instinctive capacity for adaptation. The terrain unfolded into vast, deciduous forests where leaves blanketed the ground in autumn and food sources shifted rapidly with the seasons. During warmer months, rivers teemed with fish and berry thickets ripened along the forest edges. But when winter came, these resources vanished almost overnight. The rivers froze, the forests fell silent, and snow buried the trails of prey animals. To survive, Homo erectus bands relied more heavily on their ability to track migrating herds into the open grasslands, where wind swept snow from the ground and exposed patches of vegetation. These winter migrations forced groups to move in ways their ancestors had never experienced. Instead of following herds across open plains, they now traveled through narrow valleys, around icy cliffs and over frozen streams. Mistakes could be deadly. A misstep on slick rock or a night spent without shelter could result in frostbite or exposure. Over generations, experience taught them which valleys offered protection, which slopes held hidden springs that remained unfrozen even in deep winter, and which caves were large enough to house an entire band. Fire became indispensable. Without true fire-making abilities, they relied on preserving flames through methods passed down silently, keeping embers insulated in bark, feeding them with slow-burning roots, and protecting them beneath layers of ash. Each morning, the glowing ember carried from a previous camp became the foundation for a new blaze. Fire gave warmth, allowed the digestion of dense foods, and kept predators at bay during long nights. In the bitterest months, the survival of a whole community could rest on the single glowing coal a careful elder had sheltered against their chest during a storm. Predators in the Eurasian frontier presented challenges unlike those in Africa. Cave lions, larger and more aggressive than their southern relatives, stalked game across snowy plains. Packs of wolves, masterful endurance hunters, shadowed herds for days and tested the limits of any creature unfortunate enough to fall behind. Mammalian megafauna, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and cold-adapted bovids roamed the landscape in patterns dictated by mineral-rich grounds and sheltered valleys. Homo erectus learned to navigate a dangerous equilibrium, traveling parallel to the movements of these giants while avoiding direct confrontation. Their stone tools reflected the necessities of this harsh world. While Acheulean hand axes remained central to their toolkit, the cold demanded innovations. Bones from large animals provided raw material for simple digging tools used to extract edible roots buried beneath frost-hardened soil. Sharp flakes became essential for processing meat quickly before freezing temperatures rendered carcasses too hard to cut. Survival required speed, both to claim resources before scavengers arrived and to escape before predators circled in. This constant pressure drove a subtle but significant shift in their cognition. They began to anticipate changes rather than merely react to them. When clouds gathered with a particular shape, they knew a snowstorm was approaching. When winds carried the distant scent of migrating game, they adjusted their movement accordingly. This ability to plan even a day ahead marked an important step in human evolution. Social dynamics grew more intricate as well. Harsh environments forced stronger cooperation within bands. Elders who had survived multiple winters became trusted guides. Their memories, where to find winter shelters, where streams thawed earliest in spring, became crucial for the survival of the young. These forms of knowledge, transmitted across generations, created a continuity that transcended individual lifespans. Groups occasionally encountered other bands during seasonal migrations. Sometimes these meetings resulted in tension, with both sides wary of scarce resources. Other times, curiosity prevailed. Exchanging mates helped diversify populations, while observing unfamiliar tool techniques or new ways of preserving fire offered fresh insights that spread slowly through Eurasian territories. Over thousands of years, Homo erectus gradually embedded themselves into this immense continent. They left behind clusters of stone flakes near riverbeds, darkened cave ceilings stained with soot, and butchered bones that told stories of long, grinding winters followed by brief, frantic summers of abundance. Their range extended continuously, branching into multiple routes leading eastward toward Central Asia, northward into colder plains, and westward into regions where climates oscillated dramatically. The giant expanse of Eurasia was no longer an unknown void. It was becoming their world. And though the hardships were immense, they were steadily transforming into a species capable of mastering extremes, creatures no longer bound by the African cradle that gave them life, but wanderers shaped by endless frontiers. As Homo erectus continued their gradual spread across Eurasia, the landscape began to open into vast territories unlike anything they had experienced before. The rugged highlands of the southwestern frontier gave way to sweeping grasslands, rolling steppes, and endless horizons where the wind carried the scent of distant storms. This new environment, often colder, drier, and far more expansive, presented both opportunities and dangers that required fresh adaptations from the early humans entering it. For countless generations, these steppes were shaped by powerful climatic cycles. During warm periods, they blossomed with grasses that nourished enormous herds of grazing animals. During cold phases, the land hardened with frost, becoming a patchwork of frozen soil and wind-carved dunes. To Homo erectus, such extremes demanded constant mobility. There was no single place to settle for long. Instead, survival meant following the movement of game across hundreds of kilometers, learning the rhythm of the seasons, and recognizing subtle environmental cues that signaled when to move on. Herds of ancient horses, bison, and large bovids roamed the steppes in massive numbers. Migrating in long, sweeping arcs, they carved invisible highways across the continent, pathways that Homo erectus soon learned to follow. Tracking them required endurance, intuition, and an ability to read the land. A slight disturbance in grass, a line of compressed soil, or a distant dust cloud could indicate the direction of an entire herd. These observations became part of the instinctive knowledge shared by every member of the group. The open terrain also brought new predators. Packs of wolves became constant shadows trailing behind migrating animals, looking for weakness. Cave lions roamed in smaller groups, but possessed incredible power, striking quickly when prey was vulnerable. Even giant hyenas, heavier and more formidable than their African relatives, prowled the margins of the steppe. Homo erectus moved through this dangerous mosaic with caution. Their strategy remained one of opportunistic survival, scavenging carcasses when possible, exploiting moments when predators abandoned kills, and occasionally attempting coordinated hunts in rare moments when advantage presented itself. Their stone toolkits evolved yet again in response to this new world. The cold, open steppes required durable tools capable of both processing large carcasses and cutting through tough, sometimes frozen hides. Acheulean hand axes remained central, but variations emerged depending on the materials available. In some regions, the scarcity of high-quality flint pushed Homo erectus to experiment with harder stones like quartzite or even carefully shaped river cobbles. The act of tool-making itself became a reflection of the land they inhabited. They learned that the best stones were often found along ancient riverbeds or near exposed hillsides where erosion revealed layers of flint. A sharp eye could spot a promising stone long before the first blow was struck. These simple yet vital skills helped them thrive across environments that shifted from lush summers to icy winters in the span of months. Winter on the steppe brought immense challenges. Winds swept across the plains with unbroken force, carving the snow into drifts and leaving little shelter. Temperatures plunged rapidly at night, and food sources dwindled as herds migrated southward or clustered in sheltered valleys. For Homo erectus, preparation became essential. Bands learned to anticipate the onset of winter by watching animal behavior, when deer shed their summer coats, when horses began gathering in tighter groups, or when birds migrated in long, dark streaks across the sky. These natural signs guided the timing of their movements. They sought valleys cut by ancient rivers where cliffs offered protection from wind and snow lay thinner on the ground. These seasonal refuges became crucial landmarks passed down through generations. Fire, of course, anchored their survival. Without a reliable way to generate sparks, they depended on preserving flames through remarkable persistence. Some bands developed techniques to keep fire alive for weeks, storing embers inside clay-lined pits, wrapping glowing coals in thick layers of ash, or carrying fire-holding stones heated during the day. These methods allowed them to withstand frigid nights that would have killed them otherwise. As they traveled deeper into Central Asia, the world around them expanded into a seemingly infinite expanse. The land rose in gentle waves, framed in the distance by mountain ranges that shimmered in blue and white hues. These distant peaks, though far away, exerted a subtle pull. Their rivers fed the plains, their sheltering valleys offered safety, and eventually they would become the next great barrier waiting to test the endurance of Homo erectus. For now, though, the steppes became the center of their existence, a place where movement defined life, where each new season demanded flexibility, and where the lineage of early humans continued to stretch farther across the continents than ever before. As Homo erectus continued their expansion across the great Central Asian steppes, the world around them became an enormous stage of shifting winds, migrating herds, and endless horizons. Life on these vast plains demanded a form of mobility and resilience unlike anything their ancestors had faced. The scale of the land reshaped their instincts. The long distances between rivers, the unpredictable arrival of storms, and the vast emptiness between safe refuges forced them to sharpen their awareness of the smallest signs: cracked earth hinting at hidden springs, cloud formations that warned of incoming sleet, or the faint rumble of hooves vibrating through the soil long before a herd came into view. Each day on the steppe carried risks. Summer brought scorching heat that dried vegetation into brittle strands, making food scarce for both humans and animals. Dust storms rose without warning, turning daylight into reddish haze and smothering any creature caught without shelter. Yet summer also offered abundance along riverbanks where plants flourished and herds gathered to drink. These seasonal cycles taught Homo erectus to think in patterns rather than moments. Instead of reacting to immediate danger, they learned to anticipate larger rhythms, when herds would shift north, when winter grasses would sprout in sheltered valleys, and when rivers would freeze enough to cross safely. Such knowledge passed wordlessly through generations, embedded in movement, habit, and imitation. Their shelters evolved in response to the open landscape. Caves were scarce across much of the steppe, replaced instead by low ridges, shallow depressions, and rock outcrops that offered minimal protection. Bands learned to place their camps where natural windbreaks formed, behind large boulders, along riverbanks cut into the ground, or within curves of ancient dried lake beds. Fire, more essential than ever, determined where and how long a group could remain in one place. A burned-out ember meant searching desperately for natural flames. Lightning-struck brush, smoldering tree trunks or charred patches left by spontaneous wildfires. A surviving ember meant safety, warmth, and time to prepare for the next leg of their journey. Evidence of this constant movement is found today in scattered stone tools across Central Asia. Flakes lie near ancient river terraces, hearth remnants darken patches of soil, and butchered bones mark where Homo erectus harvested meat from fallen animals. These traces reveal their roots, paths that ran along major rivers like the Amu Darya or Sir Darya long before those names ever existed, and corridors carved by migrations of horses and antelope that humans mirrored for millennia. Social life shifted as well. Bands grew accustomed to long periods of isolation, traveling for weeks without encountering another human group. When they finally met others, the interactions mattered. These moments of contact allowed for exchanges of mates, tools, and knowledge of safe winter refuges. Sometimes these meetings turned tense, especially when resources were scarce, but often they served as fleeting reunions among distant relatives whose ancestors had once traveled together. Such ephemeral connections wove an invisible thread across the steppe, linking groups that might never meet again but still shared a single expanding lineage. The megafauna of the region influenced the behavior of Homo erectus profoundly. Giant deer with towering antlers roamed forested margins, while massive bovids grazed the plains in protective clusters. Predators adapted to open terrain. Wolves, cave lions, giant hyenas forced early humans to stay vigilant at all times. At night, firelight became a circle of survival, casting shadows on the steppe and warning predators that this small band of humans was alert and dangerous enough to avoid. The ability to exploit carcasses left behind by these predators became one of the greatest advantages of Homo erectus. Armed with durable hand axes and sharp flakes, they could strip meat quickly, crack long bones with practiced force, and retrieve marrow rich in fat, an essential nutrient during harsh winters. These calories fueled their bodies for long-distance travel and fed their growing brains. As centuries turned into millennia, their presence pushed steadily eastward. The steppes widened into colossal plains stretching toward the Altai mountains, shimmering in the distance like a wall dividing worlds. To reach the lands beyond, Homo erectus would need to adapt again, this time to colder climates, denser forests, and rugged terrain where winter lasted far longer than on the open plains. But they were no longer the same beings who had once walked the African savannas. They had become creatures shaped by wind, endurance, and movement. Their identity was no longer tied to a single region, but to the vastness of the journey itself. Ahead of them lay Siberia, the Altai, and the eastern edges of the continent. Their footsteps were already beginning to echo across the spine of Asia. As the slow wave of Homo erectus migrations approached the eastern heart of Asia, the landscape began to shift once again. The open steppes gradually rose into rolling foothills, then ascended further into jagged mountain ridges that marked the western edges of the Altai. For early humans adapted to wide plains and sweeping grasslands, these mountains must have seemed immense, towering silhouettes etched against the sky, carved by ancient glaciers and veined with forests that grew darker and denser as elevation climbed. Yet the same resilience that had carried Homo erectus across Africa, the Levant, and Central Asia now pushed them upward into these new frontiers. Their movements were never sudden. No band woke one morning with the intention of climbing a mountain range. Instead, ecological pressures nudged them slowly along river valleys that wound toward the foothills. Herds of ancient horses, red deer, and wild cattle sought refuge in the mountains during harsh seasons, and humans followed. Streams flowing from the glaciers above carved narrow paths through the rock, offering precious water and pockets of vegetation even during dry periods. These paths became natural corridors, guiding early humans deeper into a world of high cliffs, cold winds, and shifting light. The higher elevations brought new challenges. Temperature swings grew harsher. Days could be warm in summer, but nights dropped sharply, chilling the air even in the height of the warm season. Winters arrived early and lingered long, blanketing the highlands in snow that muffled sound and erased trails. For Homo erectus, survival in this environment demanded new strategies. Their mastery of fire, though still dependent on preserving embers rather than creating flame, became more critical than ever. A single spark carried from a valley camp could be the difference between life and death on a wind-blasted ridge. Shelters changed accordingly. In the mountains, caves were far more common than on the steppe. Natural cavities carved by water and ice provided immediate refuge from storms. Bands often established temporary camps inside these hollowed spaces, leaving behind layers of soot that stained the ceilings and scattered stone tools across the floors. These caves became seasonal resting points for countless generations, marking the slow but steady expansion of Homo erectus into the Altai region. Stone tools evolved in response to the new terrain. The raw materials found here, dense basalt, quartzite, and high-quality crystalline flint, fractured differently than the stones of Africa or the Levant. Their hardness allowed for sharper edges, but required greater precision to shape. Acheulean hand axes produced in the Altai often displayed exceptional craftsmanship, symmetrical and durable, built to withstand repetitive strikes against bone and frozen hide. Bands that mastered the stones of the mountains gained a significant edge in processing both scavenged and hunted prey. The Altai also introduced new kinds of megafauna. Giant deer with massive antlers roamed forested slopes, while herds of thick-furred bovids gathered in sheltered valleys during winter. Predators adapted to the cold. Cave hyenas, early bears, powerful northern cats became recurring threats. The forests themselves, dense with conifers and tangled undergrowth, concealed dangers unfamiliar to steppe-adapted humans. A rustle in the trees might signal prey, or a predator watching from the shadows. Navigation thus required sharper instincts. Tracks in soft soil told stories of animals that passed hours earlier. Scents carried by mountain winds revealed distant carcasses. The broken branches along game trails became signposts guiding humans through the forests. Children born in these regions grew up learning to read these subtle clues. Their world was not the open plains of Africa, but a labyrinth of valleys, cliffs, and forests. Their bodies adapted as well. Broad chests allowed deeper breaths in thin mountain air, and stronger leg muscles supported the constant climb and descent of rugged terrain. Social structures shifted again under the demands of mountain life. Cooperation became essential when crossing hazardous passes or enduring unexpected snowstorms. Elders held invaluable knowledge, safe paths through dense trees, locations of caves used by previous generations, and seasonal patterns of game movement. These memories were passed through gestures, shared experiences, and repeated journeys. Every year the same routes were walked again, each season adding new details to an unspoken map carried within the minds of the group. Over time, Homo erectus established a presence throughout the Altai region. Archaeological traces show repeated occupation of caves, long-term use of mountain valleys, and the steady evolution of tool-making in response to the demands of the environment. Having reached this gateway into Siberia, they stood on the threshold of some of the coldest lands on Earth. But these early humans had already proven that no climate, no terrain, and no frontier could halt their gradual spread. Their footsteps continued forward, into the forests, into the snowfields, into the vast reaches of northern Asia. Moving beyond the Altai highlands, Homo erectus entered one of the most formidable environments their lineage had ever faced. The transition from mountains into the vast northern forests and river basins of early Siberia marked a pivotal moment in their journey. Here, the land stretched into an immense mosaic of taiga, marshes, frozen plains, and rivers that swelled with meltwater every spring. The scale of this region challenged every instinct and adaptation they had developed since leaving Africa. Yet they pressed forward, slowly, cautiously, but relentlessly. The Siberian frontier was a land ruled by extremes. Summers were short, intense, and crowded with life. Swarms of insects filled the air, migratory birds nested along riverbanks, and lush vegetation carpeted the forest floor. But winter brought a transformation so profound that it could erase entire landscapes under snow. Rivers froze solid, trees cracked in the cold, and winds swept across the land with cutting force. For Homo erectus, survival in this environment demanded a profound shift in behavior. Their reliance on fire became absolute. Without a dependable way to spark flames, preserving embers turned into a sacred discipline. Bands developed systems for carrying glowing coals across immense distances, wrapping them in insulating materials like dried moss, bark, or animal hide. A single ember could glow for days, protected from wind and moisture. Those who carried fire, likely the most experienced adults, held a responsibility that could determine whether their group endured the next cold night. Shelter evolved too. The Siberian forests offered more caves than the open steppes, but not enough to guarantee safety on every journey. As a result, Homo erectus began exploiting natural windbreaks, fallen logs, earthen mounds, shallow pits, and rocky alcoves. They learned to build makeshift walls of branches or stacked stones, trapping heat around their small fires. Though crude compared to later human structures, these simple constructions represented a growing capacity to modify the environment instead of merely responding to it. Their diet diversified dramatically. The taiga offered foods that neither Africa nor Central Asia had prepared them for. Edible roots buried deep beneath leaf litter, mushrooms emerging after summer rains, nuts and seeds that could be stored for short periods. Insects and fish became vital supplements during seasons when large game moved elsewhere. The rivers of Siberia, fed by mountain snowmelt, teemed with fish during the summer. With sharpened flakes and sturdy bone points, Homo erectus captured these resources, adding new skills to their expanding survival toolkit. But the most significant prey remained the megafauna of the region. Deer with thick coats roamed the forests, leaving deep tracks in the soft soil. Elk moved through marshy ground, their calls echoing across valley floors. Powerful bison migrated across open plains formed by ancient glacial activity. These animals were too strong for direct confrontation, yet they provided vital scavenging opportunities. When predators like cave lions, wolves, or giant hyenas brought down a large animal, Homo erectus followed the scent of blood and waited for their chance. Their improved hand axes, often shaped from tough quartzite found along Siberian rivers, allowed them to break into carcasses quickly, extracting meat and marrow before predators returned. Such efficiency meant survival in a land where winters punished the unprepared. The dangers of the Siberian frontier were constant. Wolves hunted in larger packs than in the Levant or Central Asia, their howls carrying through the frozen night like warnings from an unseen world. Cave hyenas ranged widely, breaking bones with tremendous force. Even bears posed new challenges, occupying caves that humans might otherwise use. To avoid confrontation, Homo erectus observed animal behavior closely. They learned which caves were inhabited, which trails predators used, and which riverbanks offered the safest crossings. Over centuries, their seasonal migrations formed patterns, long routes traced along river systems like the Yenisei or the Ob, corridors that guided them through forests, marshes, and open plains. These routes were not chosen at random. They followed the paths of game herds, the locations of natural shelters, and the rhythms of snowmelt and ice. Children raised in these regions inherited an unspoken map of the land, imprinted through years of travel. Their muscle memory, instincts, and familiarity with the terrain transformed Siberia from a hostile wilderness into a navigable world. The spread of Homo erectus across this vast northern frontier represented one of their greatest evolutionary achievements. Nowhere else on Earth demanded such intense endurance, foresight, and adaptability. Yet they succeeded, not through sudden innovation, but through countless small adjustments accumulated over thousands of years. Their journey had carried them far from Africa, across mountains and steppes, into forests shaped by ice and wind. And still, the expansion continued, branching eastward toward lands that would one day reach the Pacific coast. The story of Homo erectus was becoming global. As the slow, persistent wave of Homo erectus expansion pushed farther east, the landscape once again shifted beneath their feet. Siberia's cold forests and frozen rivers gradually opened into sprawling basins, broad floodplains, and distant horizons where the land stretched seemingly without end. For thousands of years, early humans had moved in response to climate, hunger, and opportunity, but now they were approaching regions where the sheer scale of the environment reshaped their entire understanding of the world. The farther east they traveled, the more the seasons dominated their existence. Summers were brief explosions of life, saturated green forests, swelling rivers, clouds of insects, and herds gathering near water. Winters were equally absolute, a harsh descent into silence and snow where survival depended on every decision made before the cold arrived. These vastly different rhythms forced Homo erectus to refine something that had begun earlier in the Altai, an instinct for long-term planning. They learned to anticipate migrations of prey long before the herds appeared. They recognized the signs of early frost, shrinking daylight, the way birds altered their flight paths, the sudden quiet that descended over forests. Their movements reflected this growing foresight. Instead of drifting aimlessly across the land, bands followed predictable routes, moving between summer and winter refuges. They returned to the same sheltered valleys each cold season, the same riverside clearings each summer, weaving a repeating pattern across generations. Such patterns did not require spoken language in the human sense. They were encoded in memory, imitation, and shared experience, transmitted like instinct, yet flexible enough to change with shifting conditions. As they traveled farther from the Altai, the forests thinned in some regions, replaced by open plains that blurred into the early forms of the eastern steppe. Here the wind flowed freely, carrying scents from great distances and announcing approaching storms with chilling clarity. Predators roamed these lands with designs shaped by the vastness of the territory. Wolves formed enormous packs capable of running for kilometers without rest. Early tigers, solitary and powerful, patrolled the edges of forests. Bears claimed riverside caves during winter, forcing Homo erectus to approach new shelters cautiously and learn to recognize subtle signs of occupation. The presence of these predators pushed early humans to refine their strategies for safety. Nightly vigilance became a shared responsibility, with adults taking turns watching the darkness beyond the firelight. They learned to create wind-sheltered fire pits, using natural hollows or simple barriers of stone to preserve heat. The ability to maintain fire through winter nights remained one of their most vital assets, and one of their most fragile. Across these eastern territories, stone toolkits continued to evolve. Some regions offered fine-grained flint ideal for razor-sharp flicks. Others demanded the use of harder stones like jasper, chalcedony, or even volcanic glass where available. The familiar Acheulean hand axes remained central, but their shapes shifted subtly depending on the stone and the game being processed. In areas where hides were thicker and colder, axes grew heavier and more robust. Where animals could be butchered quickly in warm seasons, lighter tools dominated. These adjustments reflected not just individual skill, but the accumulated experience of entire lineages. Food sources diversified as well. The eastern regions of Asia offered resources unseen in Africa or the Levant, seasonal salmon migrations, nuts and seeds that could be stored temporarily, root systems that remained edible even when covered by frost. Homo erectus learned to read the behavior of fish moving upriver, to harvest plants before winter buried them, and to seek out mineral-rich springs that attracted game. The social dynamics within the bands also continued to shift. Extended families remained the core, but the harshness of the environment sometimes brought multiple bands together, forming temporary clusters that shared resources or knowledge. Such gatherings, though rare, allowed innovations to spread eastward and strengthened genetic diversity. Children born in these eastern regions grew up knowing nothing of Africa, the Levant, or the steppes behind them. Their world was shaped by the great rivers of the east, the Amur, the Lena, the Kolyma, waterways that carved pathways toward lands their ancestors had not yet imagined. These rivers became natural highways, their banks lined with campsites that stretched across millennia. As Homo erectus followed these waterways deeper into the continent, they reached areas where winters were even harsher, forests denser, and distances greater than anything previously experienced. But their resilience, hardened by generations of travel, made this new frontier not an obstacle, but another step toward the unknown. Ahead of them lay the far eastern edge of the continent, a vast landscape that would one day look across narrow seas toward new lands entirely. Their journey was far from over. As Homo erectus pressed even farther east, their presence began to intertwine with the vast river systems that defined this region of the world. Rivers became lifelines, sources of fish, corridors of migration, and landmarks that guided bands across terrains too immense to navigate otherwise. Following a river meant predictable resources, easier travel, and a natural barrier against getting lost in the endless forests. Over generations, certain rivers became deeply embedded in the memory of the species. Their bends, tributaries, and seasonal rhythms became part of the mental maps carried silently within each individual. As bands moved along these waterways, they encountered new complexities within the environment. Summers brought explosive abundance, salmon and other fish migrating upriver, vegetation thriving in floodplains, and herds gathering near wetlands. But summer also brought sudden dangers, thunderstorms sweeping across the plains, rising water levels that flooded campgrounds, and insects so numerous they could overwhelm both animals and humans alike. Winters, on the other hand, stripped the land bare. The rivers froze, their surfaces turning into glittering roads of ice. Prey animals migrated into sheltered basins, and the forests fell silent beneath heavy snow. For Homo erectus, winter travel meant navigating through deep drifts, breaking through ice to access water, and relying heavily on stored embers to keep fires alive. These annual challenges sharpened their understanding of timing. A band that moved too late in the season risked becoming trapped in an exposed area with no shelter. One that moved too early could miss crucial food sources still in transition. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Homo erectus developed a rhythm that matched the pulse of the land itself. Their tools evolved to match the demands of this changing world. Along riverbanks, they discovered stones smoothed by centuries of flowing water, hard, dense cobbles ideal for shaping into axes and cleavers. In the forests, they found flint and chert hidden beneath layers of soil, fractured by freezing temperatures. Their hand axes grew more symmetrical, reflecting an understanding of balance and weight. Sharp flakes, struck expertly from prepared cores, became essential for slicing fish or carving through thick animal hide. The efficiency of their tools allowed Homo erectus to remain competitive with the predators around them. Tigers lurked in the underbrush, their movements silent and powerful. Wolves patrolled the forests in disciplined packs, testing the strength and alertness of anything they encountered. Bears claimed caves and riverbanks as seasonal territories. To navigate this dangerous web, Homo erectus relied not on brute strength, but on caution, awareness, and a growing ability to predict predator behavior. Nighttime around the fire became a ritual of survival. Adults took turns staying awake, listening for the telltale crunch of snow beneath paws or the distant howl carried over darkened forests. Firelight pushed back the shadows, but only barely. The crackling flames illuminated the immediate world around them, while everything beyond remained a shifting mystery. Over thousands of years, these experiences shaped the cognitive development of Homo erectus. Their ability to plan ahead strengthened. Memories of successful migration routes, safe shelters, and reliable feeding grounds became collective knowledge. These were not formal teachings, but deeply ingrained patterns developed through imitation and reinforced by survival. Children growing up in these eastern territories developed instincts suited for the environment, recognizing predator tracks, interpreting changes in wind direction, and anticipating the return of seasonal food sources. Social interactions remained flexible. Bands occasionally split or merged depending on conditions. During times of abundance, multiple groups might gather along river confluences, forming temporary communities where tools, mates, and knowledge were exchanged. These interactions not only supported genetic diversity, but also allowed innovations to spread across thousands of kilometers. Such gatherings reminded Homo erectus that they were part of a larger network stretched across the continent, even if they seldom met others. As the migration wave moved eastward, the land slowly transformed again. The forests began to thin, giving way to broader plains and colder winds. The shape of the sky changed as the horizon widened. Bands that followed the great rivers found themselves approaching the easternmost edges of the continent, regions where the land would one day stand only a short distance from islands and coasts across narrow seas. To these early humans, there was no concept of edge. The world simply continued, and so did they. Their journey, driven by instinct and endurance, had carried them thousands of kilometers from Africa. Yet the pull of new lands, new resources, and changing climates kept pushing them forward. The eastern edge of Eurasia was not an ending. It was another beginning, and Homo erectus was poised to confront whatever lay beyond it. As Homo erectus continued their slow march toward the far eastern edge of Eurasia, the land transformed once again. The endless rivers they had followed for generations eventually guided them into regions where the forests thinned and the air carried the briny scent of distant seas. For the first time in their long journey, the world no longer stretched infinitely ahead. The land curved toward shorelines, estuaries, and tidal flats shaped by immense geological forces. The presence of coastlines marked a profound shift in their experience. To creatures who had spent millions of years inland, crossing savannas, deserts, mountains, and taiga, the sudden transition to oceanic landscapes introduced new senses, new opportunities, and new dangers. The cries of seabirds echoed over rocky cliffs. Waves crashed against stone outcrops, producing rhythms they had never known in Africa or the interior of Eurasia. Winds carried the smell of salt, mixing with forest scents and transforming the sensory palette of their daily lives. These new environments required fresh strategies. The shifting tides created patterns unlike rivers. They revealed food during low water but swallowed the same resources hours later. Shellfish, crabs, and stranded fish became new additions to their diet. The coastline also served as a gathering point for herds drawn to beaches during certain seasons, offering scavenging opportunities unavailable in inland regions. Over time, Homo erectus learned to interpret the movements of tides by watching how water levels rose and fell against familiar rocks. They recognized that storms behaved differently near the ocean, arriving faster and carrying stronger winds. Their growing understanding of these patterns allowed them to approach the coast with both caution and confidence. The geological diversity of the coasts enriched their toolkit. Pebble beaches offered smooth stones ideal for percussion. Coastal cliffs revealed seams of flint and other fine-grained materials perfect for shaping tools. The Acheulean hand axe remained a constant companion, but coastal stones allowed for sharper, more refined flakes that enhanced butchering and woodworking tasks. Their craftsmanship improved not because of conscious innovation, but because the environment naturally encouraged it. As they explored further east, the landscape diversified into a patchwork of sandy dunes, rocky capes, tidal marshes, and forested peninsulas. Some coastlines offered wide, open beaches where they could gather shellfish in vast numbers. Others presented dangerous cliffs and pounding waves that made certain areas inaccessible. Still, the coastline's bounty was too valuable to ignore. Fish trapped in tidal pools became an easy source of protein. Birds nesting on rocky islands provided eggs. Driftwood, rare in many inland regions, washed ashore in abundance, feeding fires and enabling longer stays in coastal shelters. Sheltering behaviors adapted once again. The coastline lacked the protective caves of the mountains and forests, forcing Homo erectus to use natural overhangs, dunes, or even makeshift windbreaks of stone and driftwood. Their fires flickered against the cool ocean winds, casting shadows that danced against the sand. Nights on the coast were colder and louder, with waves pounding in the darkness and gusts carrying sprays of salt water. Yet remarkably, Homo erectus endured. Their resilience, shaped by thousands of generations of migration, allowed them to treat the coast not as an endpoint, but as another chapter of survival. The predators of the coast differed from the forests. Inland threats still existed, wolves, tigers, bears, but coastal predators like sea eagles and scavenging foxes also played their roles. Large marine mammals occasionally washed ashore, creating rare opportunities for massive scavenging events. A single stranded carcass could feed an entire band for days if processed quickly. Social dynamics continued to reflect the demands of the environment. Bands occasionally traveled together along the shore, using the expansive beaches as natural routes during warm seasons. Encounters with other humans became more common in these predictable pathways, offering moments of cooperation or tension depending on resources. Children born near the coast grew up hearing the sounds of waves as a constant presence, learning to read the tides almost intuitively. Their world was shaped not by the endless openness of the steppes, but by the interplay of land and sea, by the changing horizon where the sun rose from the water and set behind the forests. As time passed, some groups continued moving south along the coasts, while others ventured north, following fish migrations and seasonal changes. Still others turned inland again, bringing coastal knowledge with them, new foods, new tools, and new strategies for survival. Reaching the far eastern coastline marked one of the most dramatic expansions of Homo erectus since they first stepped out of Africa. Yet to them, it was simply another landscape to explore, another challenge to endure, another source of life waiting to be understood. Their journey had reached the edge of the world they knew, but the world itself still stretched farther, and their footsteps were not finished carving its shape. Life along the eastern coastline introduced patterns of survival that neither Africa nor the deep interior of Eurasia had prepared Homo erectus for. The interplay between land and sea, the rhythms of tides, the shifting winds, and the abundance of marine life created a world filled with new possibilities. Yet these same forces also brought dangers that demanded observation, flexibility, and an instinctive understanding of the environment. At first, the coast may have seemed overwhelming. The sound of waves was constant, echoing through rocky coves, amplifying during storms and rolling ceaselessly across beaches. But over generations, Homo erectus grew familiar with its patterns. They learned to differentiate the roar of incoming tides from the crash of distant surf against cliffs. They recognized how the ocean's scent shifted before storms, carrying a sharper, colder edge that signaled danger. Their movements adapted accordingly. Instead of following rivers alone, they began using stretches of coastline as seasonal highways, broad, open corridors where groups could move more easily than through dense forests or wet marshes. The sand, though tiring to walk on, provided a clear path, and the shoreline offered reliable resources at predictable intervals. Food became more diverse than ever. Shellfish, once unfamiliar, became part of their routine diet. Mussels, clams, and crabs were abundant in tidal pools, easy to gather and rich in nutrients. Fish stranded by receding tides provided quick meals, while seaweed and edible coastal plants supplemented their nutrition. The ocean offered an entirely new class of animals: seals resting on beaches, seabirds nesting in cliffs, and, occasionally, the massive bodies of whales washed ashore. When such rare events occurred, they transformed the lives of entire bands. A stranded whale could provide weeks of food: meat, fat, marrow, and bones that could be repurposed for tools. Processing such enormous animals demanded cooperation, patience, and sharper tools. Fortunately, the coastline provided ideal materials. Pebbles, smoothed by waves, became efficient hammerstones. Coastal cliffs revealed layers of fine flint, perfect for precision flaking. Acheulean hand axes became thinner and more refined as humans discovered which stones fractured with the cleanest edges. These tools allowed them to butcher meat more effectively than ever, and to carve through whale hide or large fish with unprecedented speed. As their craftsmanship improved, so did their ability to adapt to new tasks imposed by the coastal environment. Sheltering strategies also evolved. Without consistent caves, Homo erectus took advantage of natural depressions in dunes, large driftwood logs, and rock formations. They built simple windbreaks using stacked stones or branches anchored with sand. These makeshift shelters indicated an increasing willingness to modify the environment, not permanently, but purposefully, to improve survival even in temporary camps. Fire remained essential. Coastal winds, colder and more volatile, threatened to extinguish flames quickly. To counter this, bands dug shallow pits to protect embers or placed fire inside natural hollows in cliffs where wind could not reach. Driftwood, abundant on beaches, provided more fuel than they had ever known inland, allowing for longer burns and brighter flames. With fire, they cooked fish, roasted shellfish, and smoked pieces of meat to preserve them briefly during migrations. The coastline also reshaped social dynamics. Bands traveling the shore often crossed paths more frequently than those in deep forests. Certain beaches became seasonal gathering points where multiple groups met during migrations or abundant resource periods. These interactions encouraged a wider exchange of knowledge, techniques for opening tough shells, identifying safe tidal pools, or recognizing shifts in weather patterns. Over time, these exchanges strengthened the genetic and cultural fabric of Homo erectus populations living along the coast. Children born in these environments developed instincts tuned to the ocean's rhythms. They learned to dig for clams in wet sand, to avoid pools where predators lurked, and to climb cliffs safely in search of bird eggs. Their worldview expanded with each new tide. They became familiar not only with land, but with the boundary between land and sea. And yet, even as some groups established long-term familiarity with the coastline, others continued following the pull of rivers inland or drifted further north or south along the shore. The coastline offered a branching path, one that led to new territories along East Asia, and another that would eventually guide future members of the genus Homo toward island chains across narrow seas. By reaching these coasts, Homo erectus had fulfilled one of the greatest expansions in human prehistory. They had crossed deserts, steppes, mountains, and forests. They had endured ice, heat, predators, and scarcity. And now they stood at the edge of a world shaped by tides and storms. But for a species defined by movement, even the ocean could not remain a barrier forever. New paths, still unseen, waited beyond the waves. As some populations of Homo erectus spread along the coasts of East Asia, a remarkable new chapter in their long journey began to unfold. One that involved not just following the land, but confronting the vast waters that separated continents from islands. For generations, they had traveled thousands of kilometers by relying on their endurance, memory, and instincts. But now, in places where the coastline fractured into archipelagos, estuaries, and shallow channels, the world presented a challenge unlike any they had previously encountered. Sea levels during certain periods of the Pleistocene were lower than today, revealing land bridges and narrow straits where only slivers of water separated one landmass from another. These shifting coastlines created opportunities for migration that would come and go over thousands of years as ice ages pulled water into massive glaciers and interglacials returned it to the sea. To Homo erectus, these changes were not understood conceptually. They were simply part of the world they navigated. Some seasons, a distant island seemed reachable across a shallow channel. Other seasons, the sea swallowed the pathway again. In this dynamic landscape, small steps became transformative. Bands exploring tidal flats may have followed game across exposed land bridges without realizing that they were venturing into new realms entirely. Children growing up near these shores learned to read the patterns of tides and currents. They gathered shellfish from rocky outcrops that vanished at high tide. They watched driftwood float on waves and return to shore hours later, carried by currents they gradually learned to predict. Over time, these observations shaped their sense of possibility. The ocean was no longer an impenetrable barrier. It was a shifting landscape of opportunity. Some groups began pushing farther along coasts where narrow straits separated the mainland from nearby islands. They discovered that during low tides or glacial periods, these waters receded enough to create walkable paths. Even in periods when sea levels rose again, short distances tempted bold individuals to wade or swim across calm waters. And where swimming alone proved too dangerous, they learned to use driftwood or natural rafts of vegetation as support. These movements were small and gradual, but over thousands of years, they led to one of Homo erectus's greatest achievements, the colonization of islands beyond the Eurasian continent. Reaching these islands forced early humans to adapt to new ecosystems. Many islands lacked large predators, allowing Homo erectus to explore without constant fear. The forests grew differently, dense in some areas, sparse in others, depending on rainfall and volcanic activity. Birds nested in enormous colonies along cliffs, and marine resources were plentiful. These islands became laboratories of survival. Some offered rich food sources that allowed bands to thrive and grow. Others were harsher, demanding quick adaptation or immediate return to the mainland. Stone materials varied widely. On some islands, flint was scarce, compelling humans to rely on harder volcanic rocks. On others, fine-grained stones, ideal for tool-making, washed ashore from distant sources, carried by currents that acted as invisible trade routes. This diversity pushed the Acheulean tradition into new forms. Hand axes grew more compact and more efficient in regions where raw material was limited. Flakes became thinner and were used more carefully. Crafted tools became prized objects, often carried across long distances. The presence of water all around them fostered new awareness of tides, weather, and the predictable patterns of waves. Bands learned to camp on higher ground to avoid storm surges. They observed how certain winds carried fish toward shore, how seabirds circled above schools of fish, and how distant storms could be sensed long before the first raindrops fell. Social structures subtly evolved as well. Island life brought groups into closer proximity, sometimes forcing cooperation to exploit seasonal abundance. A stranded fish shoal or a large beached animal could feed multiple bands if shared wisely. In such situations, conflicts might arise, but the collective memory of famine and abundance guided their interactions. Children raised on islands grew up with a relationship to the sea fundamentally different from that of their mainland counterparts. For them, the water was not merely a boundary, it was a source of food, a path, and a force of nature that shaped their daily existence. They learned to forage in tidal pools, to climb cliffs for seabird eggs, and to recognize safe harbors where winds were less severe. Over centuries, their range expanded across island chains, forming stepping stones that linked parts of Southeast Asia. This marked a profound turning point for the species. Without boats, without language as we know it, without maps or planning, Homo erectus had nonetheless begun to cross into lands that required a new kind of boldness. Their journey, once confined to the interior of Africa, had now reached the edge of continents, the shorelines of new worlds, and the thresholds of island realms that lay shimmering beyond the waves. And though they did not know it, these early steps into island territories foreshadowed one of humanity's greatest evolutionary triumphs, the ability to cross oceans. The spread of Homo erectus across islands and coastal corridors marked a turning point not only in geography, but in the way early humans interacted with their environment. Once they had stepped beyond the mainland, the world became fragmented into countless smaller ecosystems, each unique, each demanding its own strategies of adaptation. These islands were not uniform. Some were volcanic, scarred by ancient eruptions that left behind rugged landscapes of basalt cliffs and sharp rocks. Others were low-lying sandbars shaped by tides and storms. Still others were dense with tropical forests, where unfamiliar plants and animals created new challenges. Every island was a test of ingenuity. When a band arrived on land after crossing a shallow channel or following a temporary land bridge, they faced an immediate question: stay or move on? On islands rich in shellfish, birds, and driftwood, the decision often favored staying, at least for a season. But on islands lacking fresh water or stone suitable for tools, bands moved again within days, tracing the coastline in search of better ground. This constant movement, driven by both opportunity and necessity, slowly expanded their mental maps, linking island chains into a broader network of possible routes. Over time, Homo erectus learned that the sea itself could shift these possibilities. During colder glacial periods, the oceans receded, exposing broad coastal shelves that connected islands to the mainland. Valleys that were once submerged became open plains where herds roamed. Forests expanded into regions previously underwater, and rivers carved temporary paths across the seafloor. Bands moved freely across these new landscapes, unaware that they walked on land that would one day lie far beneath the waves. When the climate warmed again and sea levels rose, these pathways disappeared, isolating populations on islands for centuries. These isolated bands developed subtle differences in tool styles, migration habits, and even body proportions. Some groups became slightly smaller, reflecting the limited resources of their new environments. Others thrived, supported by reliable coastal food sources. Despite these variations, the core identity of Homo erectus remained: endurance, adaptability, and movement. Even isolated islanders continued to travel the length of their coasts, returning to certain coves year after year, following patterns long established by their ancestors. Their diet expanded dramatically compared to earlier phases of their migration. Shellfish provided reliable protein. Fish, caught during seasonal runs, brought bursts of abundance. Birds nesting on cliffs supplied eggs during specific months, and coastal plants, Salt-tolerant grasses, edible roots, and shrubs offered nourishment even when game was scarce. These resources, however, required new approaches to gathering. Individuals learned to time their foraging with the precise rhythm of the tides. A single misjudgment could mean trapped feet in rising water or lost opportunities during low tide. The environment taught them to become observers of the world's smallest signals: the shape of waves, the movement of clouds, the behavior of seabirds. Toolmaking continued to evolve on islands where stone quality varied dramatically. On islands rich in fine-grained volcanic rock, Homo erectus produced remarkably sharp hand axes and flakes. On islands without suitable stone, they scavenged from embankments where ocean currents deposited pebbles or carried fragments from distant places. Every tool became precious in such environments. A single, finely knapped flake might be carried for months, repaired multiple times, and used for everything from opening shells to carving meat. The scarcity of materials encouraged reuse, reinforcing a deeper resourcefulness. Social dynamics shifted subtly as well. Island life sometimes forced multiple bands into proximity, sharing limited space or converging at seasonal feeding grounds. Conflicts undoubtedly occurred, but cooperation was also essential. Scavenging a beached animal or gathering at a tidal pool often required group effort. In such moments, the presence of another band could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Children raised on islands grew up with a worldview defined by cyclic change. They learned early that land could appear or vanish depending on season and tide. They recognized that storms brought not only danger, but also opportunities. Driftwood for fire, dead fish washed ashore, even carcasses of large marine animals. They learned to explore carefully, to watch the sea with respect, and to anticipate the shifting lines where land met water. These children, descendants of migrants who had left Africa generations earlier, now carried knowledge that no previous hominin had possessed. Their footsteps, like those of their ancestors, extended farther. Some bands moved south along island chains, others returned to the mainland with new skills. Still others eventually pushed toward regions that would one day become Indonesia, the Philippines, and beyond. In these new territories, Homo erectus faced challenges unlike anything seen before, including deeper seas and islands separated by channels too wide for accidental crossings. Yet even here, their instinct to extend the boundaries of their world did not fade. Their journey had brought them to the edges of continents and across the first island chains in human history. And still, the path ahead continued, winding toward landscapes that would forever change the course of evolution. As the descendants of Africa's early wanderers pushed farther into the vast archipelagos of Southeast Asia, they entered one of the most complex and challenging regions on the planet. Here, tectonic forces had fractured the land into thousands of islands, large and small, volcanic and coral, forested or barren. Narrow channels separated some islands, while others stood isolated behind deep straits carved by shifting ice ages. For Homo erectus, who for nearly 2 million years had followed rivers, coastlines, and land bridges, these new geographies presented a final and formidable test of their capacity for adaptation. The islands of what would one day be Indonesia formed a mosaic of possibilities. During glacial periods, sea levels dropped dramatically, revealing broad land masses that connected parts of Asia with territories now submerged beneath the ocean. These temporary continents, Sundaland in particular, allowed Homo erectus to move across enormous distances without ever realizing they were crossing what modern humans would later call islands. To them, the world simply expanded. The forests grew thicker, the rains heavier, and the animals larger or more unfamiliar with every new step. But when sea levels rose again, these same corridors vanished underwater, isolating populations on islands for thousands of years at a time. Each stranded community faced the challenge of surviving in an environment that could not be easily abandoned. They adapted quickly. They learned which fruits, roots, and nuts were safe. They observed the habits of crocodiles lurking in river mouths, the movement of monitor lizards across forest floors, and the flights of giant birds that nested on cliffs and coastlines. They learned to follow seasonal rains through dense jungle, reading the calls of insects and birds as signs of approaching storms. Yet the greatest barriers of all were the deep water straits that remained even during the lowest sea levels. Between mainland Asia and the islands of Java, Flores, Sulawesi, and others lay channels too wide to cross simply by walking. And yet, astonishingly, Homo erectus reached some of these islands, Flores most famously, hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans evolved the capacity for ocean voyaging. How they crossed remains one of the most compelling mysteries in paleoanthropology. Perhaps they followed driftwood, holding tightly as tides carried them across narrow sections. Perhaps storms dislodged masses of vegetation that floated long enough to serve as accidental rafts. Or perhaps, in ways we cannot fully reconstruct, they began to experiment with simple watercraft, bundles of bamboo, logs tied together, or natural rafts stabilized with branches. Whatever the mechanism, the outcome was extraordinary. Homo erectus began to cross genuine ocean barriers. Once they reached isolated islands like Flores, evolution accelerated in new directions. Limited resources favored smaller body sizes in many populations, while other groups adapted to local megafauna unlike anything seen elsewhere. On some islands, immense carnivorous birds stalked the forests. On others, dwarf elephants roamed in small herds, providing both danger and opportunity for scavenging. The challenges of island life required even sharper survival instincts. Stone resources varied dramatically, and on some islands, suitable tool-making rocks were scarce. This scarcity forced Homo erectus to become more efficient than ever with their tools. A single flake might be sharpened repeatedly or used until it wore down to a sliver. The Acheulean hand axe persisted but often developed unique regional forms, thinner, smaller, or shaped out of materials rarely used elsewhere. Still, the greatest transformation was not physical or technological, but cognitive. The experience of isolation, scarcity, shifting coastlines, and new predators demanded deeper foresight and greater cooperation. Bands needed to plan more carefully before moving into unfamiliar forests. They needed to anticipate the seasonal behavior of island animals. They needed to maintain fire not just for warmth, but to adapt to storms and monsoons that swept across the islands with terrifying force. Children raised on these islands absorbed new ways of seeing the world. They learned to navigate dense forests where light barely penetrated. They learned to follow the rhythm of coastal tides and the movement of clouds that signaled the approach of tropical storms. Their lives were shaped not by open plains or endless steppes, but by enclosed ecosystems where every sound mattered. Slowly, the easternmost populations of Homo erectus reached the geographic limits of the Old World. Beyond certain islands lay waters too deep, too wide, and too unpredictable to cross by accident. Their expansion slowed, not because they had exhausted their will to explore, but because the planet itself created barriers that even their remarkable resilience could not overcome. Yet they had already achieved something extraordinary. A species born on the savannas of East Africa had spread across 3/4 of the Old World, adapting to deserts, mountains, steppes, forests, and island chains. They had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, predators, and ecological upheavals. They had become true global wanderers long before modern humans took their first steps. And their journey was not over. One more step remained, one final chapter before their lineage branched into new forms that would one day inherit the entire world. As the last waves of Homo erectus expansion spread through Southeast Asia's intricate maze of forests and islands, their long evolutionary journey approached its final turning point. They had crossed deserts, mountains, frozen plains, and coastlines that stretched to the horizon. They had braved predators, storms, and endless cycles of scarcity and abundance. Yet what ultimately shaped their destiny was not a single catastrophe or dramatic event, but the slow, steady passage of time and the emergence of new human forms evolving from the very foundations they laid. Across the islands of Indonesia, populations of Homo erectus lived for hundreds of thousands of years in environments that were as unforgiving as they were rich. The monsoon rhythm became the heartbeat of their world. Rains swept across the islands in towering walls of water, transforming streams into torrents and forests into flooded labyrinths. Dry seasons followed, cracking the soil and drawing animals toward shrinking water sources. In this cycle, Homo erectus learned to move with remarkable precision. They recognized which valleys filled with game as the rains retreated, which caves remained dry during storms, and which stretches of coastline revealed shellfish beds at the lowest tides. Such knowledge was passed not through words, but through repetition, actions performed so consistently that they became instinctive. Their adaptability remained their greatest strength. When volcanic eruptions reshaped landscapes, burying forests, choking rivers, darkening skies, Homo erectus did not disappear. They shifted to new areas, scavenged where fresh opportunities appeared, and followed surviving herds into untouched regions. Their stone tools changed slowly but steadily, shaped by the materials available on each island. In regions where flint was scarce, they crafted axes and flakes from dense volcanic rock, developing new methods to strike, shape, and sharpen each tool. Every island population added a new thread to the tapestry of Acheulean craftsmanship. But while their technological world remained simple, their cognitive world was growing more complex. Living in isolated environments required deeper planning, anticipating food shortages, recognizing seasonal migrations, and identifying safe shelters long before storms arrived. Children learned through endless exposure, memorizing the calls of animals, the signs of approaching danger, and the locations of life-saving resources. Slowly, without any dramatic leap, the minds of these early humans changed. They became better at predicting, adapting, and coordinating. Their societies grew more cohesive, shaped by environments that demanded cooperation during both abundance and scarcity. Yet evolution does not stand still. As Homo erectus populations persisted in Southeast Asia, other branches of the human lineage began to appear elsewhere. In Africa, new hominins emerged with slightly larger brains and more complex behaviors, Homo heidelbergensis, followed eventually by Homo sapiens. In Europe and parts of Asia, other descendants, Neanderthals and Denisovans, developed adaptations suited to colder climates and more intricate social structures. These newer forms carried forward many of the traits first pioneered by Homo erectus: endurance, tool use, social cohesion, but refined them with greater intelligence, cultural depth, and technological innovation. Meanwhile, the most isolated populations of Homo erectus faced their own evolutionary pressures. On Flores, for instance, small-bodied hominins, Homo floresiensis, appeared, shaped by island dwarfism and ecological constraints that forced every trait toward efficiency. This extraordinary variation showed how flexible the lineage of Homo erectus could be, splitting into unique forms depending on habitat. Still, the original Homo erectus persisted. For nearly 2 million years, they remained one of the most successful hominin species ever to exist, far longer than modern humans have yet managed. Their success came from consistency, the ability to survive in nearly any environment, to endure long periods of hardship, and to move whenever the land demanded it. But as climates shifted and new hominins expanded across the globe, the world began to change around them. The rise of more cognitively advanced human species led to increasingly complex forms of tool-making, communication, and social organization. Over time, these new species outcompeted remaining Homo erectus populations, filling ecological niches with greater efficiency. Some regions experienced sudden climatic stresses, droughts, volcanic eruptions, or changes in sea levels that isolated or weakened existing Homo erectus groups. Others may have seen direct competition with incoming humans. Slowly, their numbers dwindled. Not in a single moment, not in a dramatic extinction, but in a gradual fading as the world moved into a new evolutionary chapter. The last known populations of Homo erectus survived in Indonesia, likely on Java, until roughly 100,000 to 120,000 years ago. Long after they had vanished from Africa, the Middle East, and mainland Asia, these final communities persisted in pockets of forest and coastal refuge, still using the same robust hand axes their ancestors had carried out of Africa nearly 2 million years earlier. It is possible that these final groups witnessed the distant arrival of other human types, more advanced, better equipped, but the archaeological record leaves their final days shrouded in silence. What remains clear is this: Homo erectus did not vanish because they failed. They faded because the world they had helped create gave rise to successors shaped by their own legacy. Their footsteps paved the paths modern humans would later follow. Their endurance opened continents. Their adaptability laid the groundwork for everything that came after. And though they disappeared, their influence runs through every branch of humanity. The story of Homo erectus is not just one of survival. It is one of triumph across unimaginable distances, of a journey that carried our ancient ancestors from the heart of Africa to the farthest edges of the Old World. Their legacy lives in every step we take, every new horizon we cross, and every distant frontier humanity still seeks.